Okay, now that we're recording, I will get started with introduction for a presentation that I've been looking forward to for a while now. If you happen to be on Twitter and follow behavioral medicine things, I basically post about it once a day. Guillaume Chevance is a scientist, an assistant professor at ISGlobal, who I think is going to end up being one of many who will exemplify a career path in the future from behavioral medicine into a sort of climate-focused behavioral medicine. And I was fortunate enough to interact with Guillaume through an SBM working group and a couple of other things. And he may be a co-author on a paper he was working on, and it really gave me some deep insight into some of the challenges we face in the near future, as well as some of the opportunities we have as a field. So Guillaume, he did his PhD in human movement sciences at the University of Montpellier in France in 2017. Then went to University of California, San Diego, working on eHealth interventions. And then by October 2020, became an assistant professor there at ISGlobal, which is a leading European institution in global or planetary health. And he's really, I think, a voice crying out in the wilderness, telling us where we need to go as a field. So I don't want to take up any more time. I want to make sure that he has plenty. Guillaume has offered to go dual screen. So he'll have the Q&A, the chat open on one side if you want to interact with him, if you have questions throughout. He's willing to give it a shot, sort of following both. At the same time, there will be a question and answer period at the end that I'll be moderating. So if you have questions and they don't get answered in the chat, or if you want to hold them for the end, also great. But at this point, I want to hand it over, Dr. Chevance.
Thank you very much, Don. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you this evening for me because it's 5 p.m. here in the Pyrenees. I had quite a boring day with a lot of administrative things, so it's a great pleasure to finish the day with some science and to discuss with you. Thank you very much, Don, and thank you very much, Lily, for managing this talk, for inviting me and sending me all these reminders, etc. As Don said, I have the chat open right here, and I will try to look at it so we can do something a bit more interactive than a traditional presentation. And if you want to ask some question while I'm talking, I'm happy to look at it and to see if I can react. So Don told you everything you need to know about me. I see myself as an interdisciplinary researcher. I have some difficulties to put myself into a specific box. But most of my time, I'm doing things in the behavioral medicine, digital health, and data science field. I have a mixed background with some sports sciences, psychology, and digital health. And I started to take a turn in my research career some years ago, 2 years ago, toward this topic of climate change. And one of the objectives of this talk also today is to show you that it's not a big deal actually to take this turn, and like some small adjustment in your research can be made to start working on that topic of climate change. And just to give you some background about that, it happens in 2 steps for me. The first one is a paper that has been published by a colleague and friend, Paquito Bernard, who is professor in Montreal, and that published this short commentary for the health psychology community in 2019. And I think he sent me a draft of this commentary in 2018. And I started to realize that actually I could relatively easily put some of my skills in behavior change toward this objective of climate change mitigation and adaptation relatively easily. And then I had the chance to join this institution, which is ISGlobal in Barcelona, which is like one of the best institutions in Europe to think about environmental health and planetary health. So now I have a lot of colleagues around me that are climate change specialist, and well, actually it's great to work in such an interdisciplinary space. And I think it's a point also for you. I will tell it again after during the talk, but do not hesitate to match up. We don't see a lot of interaction right now between behavioral scientists and climate change scientists, but I really do think that the connection between these two dots could be done relatively easily. And you just have to find like the good guys to work with and to start doing some stuff between these two fields. Let's jump into the news. I would like to start with some information about climate change, because I don't know if we are on the same page or not, and there is some important point that we need to define before jumping on the topic of behavior change and climate change. In the last August, we saw the publication of the last report from the IPCC, which is probably a group that you know. It's an international group, basically providing advices and scientific literature review about the state of the climate. And this group is not about conducting empirical research, but it's about putting a lot of scientists from a lot of disciplines together and telling a bit to the world what is the state of the climate right now. And I encourage you to see this, the outcome, the output of this group, because it's very interesting, and most of the time it's relatively easy to understand. The main point that they raise in their last report is that basically, yes, we know for sure now that beyond the non-human impact on climate change, human does have an impact on climate change. This impact is very easy to understand. After the World War II and starting during the past industrial revolution, human activities greatly increased. So we started producing more and more things, the population grew, we started to use more and more energy, and by using more and more energy, obviously we produce more and more greenhouse gas emission, and this greenhouse gas emission, we know for sure now, is creating some like very important impact on the climate. This impact also today can be observed with a warming Earth, and today we can observe that the average warming is around 1 degree. There is geographical disparities, so it's an average of 1 degree, but for example, in Northern America, in some part of the Canada, there is already an average plus 4 degrees Celsius in the temperature comparing to the previous century. And another point which is very important to understand is that this change occurs during a very short period of time, which is really different comparing to the fluctuation we observed in the climate during the past years. So it means that, as I told you, starting at the Industrial Revolution, so not a long time ago, very few years ago, and with a big acceleration after the Second World War II, everything changed a lot in terms of climate. And it's very different from the natural fluctuation that has been observed in past climate during the past years. A third point, which is raised in this report and also very important to have in mind, is that we know for sure also now that the change in the climate has a strong impact on a lot of weather extreme. And this is true for every region across the globe. And these weather extremes are like heat waves, heavy precipitation, drought, and some kind of cyclones episodes. It's a map of the last summer extreme weather events, and we have seen in the media everywhere all the stuff that are happening. And actually, we know with some strong evidence that there is an increase in this extreme event, and this should again be more and more frequent with higher occurrence of extreme events in the next years as a consequence of climate change and global warming. I'm not explaining the mechanism here. Another mission of the IPCC, which is very important, is to provide some scenarios for policymakers or just like citizens to know a bit what could be the evolution of the climate over the next years in regards of the evolution of the climate these past years. And you might be familiar with this kind of graph. here it's the scenarios from the IPCC, so it's the last scenarios about our emission of CO2 and other greenhouse gas, like the methane, for example, that you have here on the right of the graph. And you can see that there is 4 scenarios. Right now we are around here, so again, it's a very important time in our history, but actually it was the same already before. And we have different scenarios. We have scenarios where the IPCC thinks that we could maybe start decreasing progressively our emissions by the end of the century, linear increase, higher increase, and like sharper decrease in our emissions. And these scenarios depend on different things, depend on like the projected human activities. Some of them are including new technologies. We will discuss this point after, like carbon removal or these kind of things. But yeah, basically here are the different scenarios that are provided by the IPCC. And these scenarios, in terms of projection of CO2, do have an impact on the average temperature that we could know at the end of this century. So here you can see the average temperature for the 5 scenarios. And we are already at 1 degree. And as you can see, by the end of the century, if we are taking like mid scenario, we should be around 2 or 2.5 degrees more than the reference period, which was the past century, basically. And this is quite problematic because some other scientists are questioning the fact that even a small increase in the temperature, such as 2 degrees on average on Earth, could have very strong impact on a lot of different things, because we have to think climate change in terms of complex things. And complex systems are made from something you might know, which is feedback loop. And here you have an example of a very easy, understandable feedback loop, which is when the temperature rises, the ice melts faster and the reflective ice disappears, and so the temperature increases again. And the point is that we don't really know right now what will happen even with just 2 degrees more than the reference period. And it is possible that crossing these 2 degrees would start basically a cascade of nonlinear events that could lead us very quickly to another scenarios, which will be like very problematic. And the point in complex system, as you can see in this picture too, is that probably if we are unable to limit this global warming, we might be dropped into a very difficult place in which it will be very difficult. We might be stuck, in a very difficult attractor in which it will be like tricky to escape in the future. So we are really in a moment where we are in an unstable world and things might not be linear. We might experience a lot of non-linearities in the next years. Something I want to make explicit also is that also here I'm focusing on climate change. It's not only about climate. And you might be aware of this framework, which is a framework published by Stephen in Science some years ago, which is about the concept of planetary boundaries. And by today, we know that we already crossed some of these boundaries, such as the biosphere integrity, the land system change, and the biogeochemical flows. And each of these boundaries, which are interconnected with climate change, but also relatively independent, might have very strong impact on our civilization health. So it's not just about climate change, which is a big issue, because, for example, if we are able to fix our carbon dioxide emission, this will not, or maybe not, this will not have big impact on biosphere integrity, because even with a lot of renewable energy, we could continue killing the biosphere integrity and destroying the land system, as well as the biogeochemical flows. So it's more complex than just providing technical solution to climate change. It's a whole system that is impacted right now. When I'm giving this kind of talk, I always have a lot of questions about COVID. So usually I'm not discussing it during the talk, but more during the discussion. But today I thought that it would be important to put it here directly. So yes, we observed during the COVID a very interesting and sharp drop in our emissions comparing to the past year, around 6 to 7% in 2020. But the point is that today we came back to the normal, and we are even observing, depending on the countries and depending on the outcome, we are observing some rebound effects, which are like an higher consumption than what we saw before. Here you have an example for electricity consumption. So as I was telling you, during the COVID-19 like first surge, basically we slow down all our activities, we stay at home, we stop consuming a lot of things, and obviously all this lake of human activities put less pressure on our energy system, and then progressively we come back to the normal with now, as I was telling you, some kind of rebound here, and we are like keeping this growth in energy consumption, which is growing like year on year on year on year. Here I will do a very big digression, and but I thought it might be important because I want to give you here my understanding of the situation, which is very subjective and which is very like my own understanding of the situation. So some might not be agree with that, but yeah, I think it's important to set up the discussion by telling you that. The point is that in our current societies, and especially in Europe and in the US, we are stuck into this GDP growth mindset. So we are looking for bigger economies, growing economies, and again and again. And we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of call from different scientists to say, hey, that's the good moment to maybe slow down and to start doing something else after the pandemic. And actually, we are not observing it because, as I told you, we are really stuck into this, this growth mindset. And I want to show you how it is related. So here you have two graphs that come from a French engineer, which is called Jean-Marc Jancovici, and he's doing some talk in English. I really recommend you this talk. So can we save energy, jobs, and growth at the same time, or will technology save us from climate change? He's a very, very important guy in France on the debate about climate change, and in Europe also. And here you can see that it computed the cross correlation over time between GDP and oil consumption. And as you can see, there is a very strong correlation between the two. So it means that obviously the more we are growing, the more we are consuming, and GDP is not only bad, GDP is also like better health sectors, it's more development in good area of our life, but it's always more energy. Today we are able to speak together because there is data centers dealing with our like connection. I have a computer coming from China with some rare earth into it, and all our activities from every day are closely linked to energy. So the more activity, the more energy. And here, same things, you can see the correlation between CO2 emission and GDP, and it's almost like perfect correlation. Why it's important? It's important because we can see different things in the literature right now, not that much in the literature, in the scientific literature, but more in the media, with a lot of people saying that that's fine, we can still continue on the same pace, doing the same activity, not changing our behaviors, not changing our way of life, because we have solution. So what we can hear is like some stuff about technology. For example, carbon removal is very fashion right now, and some other things about renewable energies. And I want to discuss a bit this point. So here you have the consumption of, the CO2 emission over time worldwide from a long time ago. And here you can see different technological improvement, and actually there is no disruption in our CO2 emission over time that are related to technology. So the more we are gaining technological knowledge and developing new technologies, the more we are consuming energy. There is always rebound effect. Even when we develop something to save energy, we are saving energy, but we are reusing this energy for something else. There is always rebound effect in our human history, showing that even with technology, we are always consuming more and more and more. The other argument that we saw a lot in the media is about okay, one solution might be to drastically shift quickly toward renewables energy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not telling you that it's a bad idea to shift for renewable energy. Obviously, we should put a lot of effort into that direction. But this graph has been very important for me to understand the scale of the problem. Here you have worldwide the different source of energy that we used over time. So obviously at the beginning, we were only using wood. Then we started to use coal, and then we started to use oil. And today it's all the energy that we are using. And we are using more than 40% of our energy, 80%, sorry, is coming from fossil fuels. And this very tiny, tiny part here is about renewables, so solar and wind and other renewables. And the point is that if we want to keep the same lifestyle, but reducing our CO2 emission, we have to basically change all this energy by renewable energy. And I'm not saying that it's impossible. I do think that it's impossible, but it's not my role to tell you that. I'm not a specialist on this topic. But if it's not impossible, we have to admit that it's going to be very, very tricky. And we should not fall into this trap of putting too much expectancies on technology and these kind of things. Here you have a very good article in Nature Climate Change published this past year, which is talking about, from the beginning of the political discussion about climate change, the role of technological promises and the negative role actually of technological promises in basically reducing actions toward mitigating climate change. So I'm telling you that because there are another way of thinking the problem, and I do not have the solution, but it's interesting to have this diagnostic, which is about thinking our Earth, our planet, as finite systems with some limit, with some carrying capacity. And this is, I think, really interesting for behavioral scientists to think about how we could slow down basically in our way of life also today. When I'm telling you that, I'm mostly talking about the highest, like the richest countries in the world, and obviously that we need to let some space to the folks in LMICs to develop. But I'm mainly talking about the main contributors to climate change that are Europe, the US, and now China, because we are delocalizing all our industries there. So here, there are some very good books about this mentality of slowing down and the planetary boundaries. You can tell me in the chat, I will be curious to know if you know this one, because it's a classic from the American literature, The Limit to Growth, produced by some guys from the MIT in the 70s. So if some of you have already read that book, I will be curious to know that. And about this philosophy, I want to re-explain you with other words. Here you have some graph where there is the growth of a system in plain line, and in dot line, the carrying capacity of the system. And today, I think that most of our politicians think that we are here. So it means that we do not think the growth of our societies without any limit. Everything is unlimited. We do not have carrying capacity, we do not have like material limit, we do not have physical limits, and we are just thinking about growing, 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 and growing. And actually in control system engineering, there is a lot of researchers thinking about, in a system, what is the carrying capacity? Something cannot grow at the infinite, and where is this limit? And if we were like a smart civilization, maybe we would have been able to take into account this carrying capacity and to maybe reduce some of our consumption to not cross this carrying capacity. But actually now we are at this point where we indeed cross this carrying capacity according to different articles, and there is different kind of carrying capacity. And the future will be probably between these two scenarios. So I do not wish like a total societal collapse, but my personal conviction is that it's going to be difficult to live the same life that we live today in the future, and we will have to adjust anyway. That will be better if it's something that we could plan, but I'm not sure that we will have the opportunity to plan it. And obviously, like the worst case scenario is a societal collapse. And just to give you a very practical example, but if you think about some island, it's very good to think in terms of island. There is some, for example, I don't remember the name in English, in the Pacific, the Eastern Island, there is some hypothesis about the collapse of this society due to an overutilization, overgrowth of the resources on the island, and the impossibility then, when they reach this ultimate point of population, to sustain because they already consume everything. It's also what happened in the Japan history more recently, but in Japan, they have been able to slow down actually in this scenario their consumption, notably of wood, and to decrease their expansion, to not basically kill all their forest and their ecosystem. And it's very interesting to think this limitation that apply to the Earth, I think, but in a smaller scale, like in Ireland. So it was a big digression, but I wanted to tell you that because I think that it's also very important for behavioral scientists to think in terms of what are the limits. And me, it's my main understanding of the climate change issue right now. So again, I don't want to tell you that this is the truth because we don't know yet, but it's my conviction. So now let's jump to this topic of climate change and health. And I think it's why you are here today. So you probably have seen all these presentations and editorials these past years in very famous journals like the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, etc., telling that basically the health system will have to adapt in the next year, and we will have to adapt to increasing heat-related issues, pollution-related illnesses, reduced food quality, quantity and security, freshwater scarcity. All these things might bring more violence, more mental health issues, and more propagation of infectious disease. So here, I do not want to focus on all these topics, but we will focus on the topic of health behaviors. And it's a question that we started to think about with this team of authors that you can see some months ago, now actually 1 year ago now, when we tried to think about what could be the implication of climate change for behavioral medicine and how behavioral medicine can help coping with this issue. So we did a narrative review that you can find online on the Open Science Framework repository. You can type my name or I can put it in the chat later. And the objective of our work was to identify the bidirectional association between climate change and health-related behaviors. So two main kinds of questions: how is climate change shaping health behaviors, and how can health behaviors influence climate change for better and for worse? Very quick point about the definition. In this paper, we focus on rising average temperatures, increasing occurrence and intensity of natural disasters, air pollution, and rising sea level for climate change. And we define health behaviors in terms of behavioral patterns and actions that relate to health maintenance, restoration, and improvement. So let's directly jump into the results. Thank you, Don, for the chat. Here is a map, which is a working document. So these things will change because we receive some great feedbacks from reviewers and other like open review on this paper. So we'll have to change it a bit. But here, basically, it's a map of all the association that we find in the literature between behaviors that are circles, nodes in this graph, and square that are climate change outcomes. And we see different kind of association. We see like some threat. So obviously, for example, there is a lot of literature about how natural hazards can impact sleep quality or physical activity. There is a lot of literature about the negative impact of higher air pollution in cities on physical activity and active transportation. We also observe some interesting paper about the adaptation and mitigation role of health behaviors toward climate change. So, for example, just here again to give you some example, interesting article about how sports practices can help coping with negative impact of within or between country migration and refugees. And some also interesting article about the role of our eating behaviors in terms of greenhouse gas emission and notably the role of decreasing red meat in greenhouse gas emission. We also find some paper talking about feedback loops or bidirectional association between the behaviors and climate. And one who is very easy to understand is the one between active transportation and air pollution. So most of the time, the more there is active transportation, the less there is air pollution. The less there is air pollution, the more there is active transportation. But it's also true in the other way around, which make it complex. And we also find some article talking about the amplification role of different health behaviors towards climate change. So that's the role for physical activity, for example. That's the role for food also. So it means that some of our physical activity practices could have a positive impact for health, same thing for food, but a negative impact on the environment. I will give you like other example right after. So basically, here it's the result of our work. We find a lot of different articles talking a lot about a lot of different associations in the literature between different climate change outcomes and behaviors, and taking this problem in a lot of different ways. So sometimes showing that climate change is a threat for our behavior. So there is a natural disasters and or wildfire, and I'm experiencing sleep disorders. Some papers talking about the adaptation mitigation role of the behaviors towards climate change, so the other way around. Some paper talking about feedback loops, and some paper also talking about the amplification role of some of our health behaviors toward climate change. So I want to summarize this association with this graph. So the key messages of our paper is that it seems that we can observe bidirectional relationships between the two. Health behaviors as a role in coping with climate change, both in terms of mitigation, which will be, for example, decreasing our greenhouse gas emission, and also in terms of adaptation. And in the other way around, so adaptation, sorry, coping with the negative effect of climate change. And the other way around is also true because changes in our climate is also impacting a lot of our health behaviors. So as I told you, this impact of health behaviors and climate change can be positive or negative. So positive impact is active transportation, reducing meat consumption. I'm citing these two famous ones because we know for sure that their impact are very important at the individual level to reduce your own carbon footprint, but that could be also negative. For example, I have a study in mind which was done among German adults practicing sports. And they saw in this paper, they were computing the carbon footprint from German adults, and they were trying to understand which kind of adults are presenting like higher carbon footprint. And they observed that people that were doing some sport and some specific sport that required a lot of transportation actually had a very strong carbon footprint comparing to other German adults. So they were more active, which is good in terms of health, but their carbon footprint, because of the kind of activities they were performing, were also higher. And as I told you, in the literature, there is two different things. Don't take it as a strong dichotomy. You know, it's nothing is always binary. It's more like a continuum, but there is some action that are more toward adaptation. So for example, developing a sports program to help some young people that has been impacted by natural disaster to recover in terms of mental health after disasters. And mitigation, which is more about changing our food habits, for example, to reduce our carbon footprint. For the other association from climate change to health behaviors, something we observe is that this association could be direct or indirect. So direct will be, for example, a natural disaster that could impact your playground near to your home. There is a lot of article about the Hurricane Katrina in the New Orleans, for example, showing that this destroyed a lot of things that have to be rebuilt. And there is also like more indirect pathway, notably through mental health, for example. So natural disasters creating some mental health issues, and these mental health issues translating into worst health behaviors, like worst sleep and things like that. And it's also interesting to see in the literature that there is different time scale. There is behavioral shock that are about natural disaster and the impact on the behavior. And there is also more secular trends. It's not only true for the food sector, where there is things that are changing very progressively, but that could have a strong impact later in time. I know that in this group, the science of behavior change, you care about mechanism. Actually, we did not find a lot of studies explicitly mentioning the mechanism between these two. So there is some research to do in that domain. We find some studies showing, as I told you, that mental health could be a mediator of some climate change outcome toward the deterioration of sleep. And but it's approximately anything we find. So here is one, just I'm throwing it here as an example. It will be interesting to see the impact of heat on motivation and the role of motivation as a mediator, explaining maybe the relationships between heat variability and physical activity. So a lot of research might be done in this domain. Something which is important also in our work, and I will accelerate a bit because time is running, it's the equity issue. So basically, we need different strategies and we need different objectives depending on the context. So that might be obvious, but we are not always doing it in health research. Sometimes we are thinking that something that works in one context will work in another. And I think that especially about climate change, this is really not true. So obviously there is some very strong equity issue in terms of behavior change within country. So we know that the more you have money, the more you have like an higher carbon footprint because you are consuming more, you live in a bigger house, you have a bigger car, you are doing more things. And it shows that if we want to engage in mitigation things and try to help people reducing the carbon footprint of their health behaviors, we might want to focus on the rich people and not on poor people. Yeah, I told you it was to give you an example of this German adult that was like practicing more physical activity, and their physical activity practices were related to their carbon footprint. So it was just to explain. Another good example that I have about within countries impact is a study done in San Francisco, showing that people with less financial resources need to take more active transportation during heat extremes, causing more heat stresses. So it's interesting because they are like doing more active transportation, which is good when we take the health lens, but actually they are also more subject to heat stresses in case of heat extremes. So it's complex. There is also some issues at the between countries level. So basically the point is that high income countries are the main drivers of climate change, and LMIC right now are more rapidly than the others suffering from the negative impact. So it means, as I told you before, that for example, if you are interested in sustainable diet, so promoting diet which is healthy but also sustainable, doesn't make sense to implement these things in a low-income population or LMIC, and it's really a problem for high-income countries. And at the opposite, for when you think about fresh water scarcity, it's becoming very urgent in LMIC, and it's not yet an issue that we have in our country, not yet. There is also some interesting work talking about the intergenerational level and equity in terms of health. And basically the point is that the next generation will have to deal with a way more unstable world with probably way less resources, notably in terms of energy, because we have like depleted everything before to cope with it. So there is some very interesting article talking about how we can motivate young generation to take some path right now, knowing that we did not do it before. So there is a kind of, to me, it's close to the delay discounting literature in the health behavior domain, and it's interesting. Here it's a graph very quickly from the book, The Limit to Growth, I told you, trying to think about behaviors in terms of space and time. So obviously it's more easy to think locally and in very short terms, and it's more difficult to think in higher space and higher time. But actually it's this direction that we should take in every decision and behavior we promote. There is some also interesting paper about women and male health disparities in terms of climate change. So I'm not saying that one group is more affected by climate change than the other, but just the risk might be a bit different. The key message is, again, is that context matters a lot, and behavior change objectives and strategies should be mapped along these different key differences. and I'm not aware of papers doing it. So I think it's also something that we will have collectively to think about, and maybe to help our colleagues to think about what are the priorities depending on these different contexts and populations. Very briefly, something I would like to discuss also is some complex thinking about climate change. A term that you have to remember is the rebound effect. So in environmental psychology, rebound effect is everywhere. So it means that when you are promoting something, you have to care about the secondary effects. I can give you an example. There is studies showing that, for example, when we ask people to decrease their meat consumption, actually they decrease their meat consumption, but they replace meat by some other carbon-intensive food, and at the end, their carbon footprint are not decreasing. The last time I was checking an interesting discussion on Twitter, and a guy published a paper to compute the carbon footprint saved from very small trips that you can do by bike instead of by car. And actually someone react and say that the carbon footprint that you can save from small trip by bike instead of car was equal to a snack, like a Mars or a Twix or something like that. So it will mean that if you take your trip by bike and then you eat a Twix, at the end you are like in the same value in terms of carbon footprint. So yeah, just to say that rebound effects are everywhere in this literature, and I think that what we know in the behavioral domain about multiple health behavior change can help here. There is something else that is very common in this literature, is the false dichotomy between collective and individual actions. I really urge you, maybe it's not the case, but if it's the case, I really urge you to stop thinking collective versus individuals. I really do think that it's false, and that we should think the two paradigms at the same time. We have evidence that for sure when we change the environment, we change the behaviors. But I think could be pretty sure too that when there is natural change in behaviors, natural change in social norms, there is also some more like structural level change that occurs, because again, like policies do not happen for nothing. They happen because they feel that something is happening in the air. And I think that both paradigms are true and should be taken together. Here I recommend this article about how to think collective and individual behavior change together. So it's an interesting one. In this paper, we also tried to, based on this literature, to produce a new definition of health behavior. So I'm happy to get your feedback on it and to know what do you think about. Again, I'm not talking about a published paper, it's a preprint. So if you want to send me feedback after this presentation, really, I take it. And here's the definition that we provide, trying to integrate these different things. So health-related behaviors can be defined as actions, patterns of actions within a context that enable human choices that result in reduced to net zero carbon, energy, water, and ecological footprint, and indirectly result in equitable improvement, restoration, and maintenance of health for humans, and also health of non-human life for current and very important future generation. And this definition also means that all behaviors that are accelerating climate change are potentially unhealthy behaviors, because obviously climate change is impacting our health at the end of the loop. It's the last sentence of our work. I really encourage you to think about this notion of limits. It took me some time at the beginning of this talk to discuss it, but I think it's really important to have in mind when we will plan the next generation of research in terms of behavior change and climate change. And I also would like to tell you that in this paper, we are providing a summary of the proposition for future research, which is in the table 1 at the end of this paper. So same thing, I encourage you to check the preprint, and if you have something that pop up, do not hesitate to come back to me. It's a working document. And yeah, it was obvious. I received a feedback from one of the reviewers that was a very good feedback, telling me you are not creating in this paper any link between the tools we have in behavioral science and in health behaviors and this topic of climate change. Obviously, and it's why I told you at the beginning that it was not that difficult, I think, to do this term. We have already a lot of tools like the BCG taxonomies, the different framework that we have in the literature for health behaviors that could be applied to these topics of climate change in the health or more in the pro-environmental domain. So we do not have to change everything. I think we all have some really interesting tool in our hands that could be used for different outcomes. So we just have to turn a bit the end toward like different outcomes and not change all our like scientific career or path to start working on this climate change topic. I want to thank my team also for this paper. It's, I think, obvious that for this kind of topic, you need interdisciplinary team. So in the behavioral medicine domain, we need to create some bridges with climate science, and I'm sure that this will happen more and more in the future. I would like to finish on this slide just to tell you that we are publishing different kind of work on this question of climate change. Here is a systematic review about climate change and physical activity, and here is a commentary in the Lancet about digital health at the age of the Anthropocene and the role of digital health, negative role actually of digital health in terms of climate change. So I wanted to finish by opening up the perspective here. And thank you very much. I'm done.
Guillaume, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing such a broad perspective and helping us to sort of get into the mindset or framework that motivates your work. And I think it really has struck a lot of people. I can tell you that I'm excited in part because as I've read through the participant list, the people who are watching your presentation today, I see many senior leaders at the National Institutes of Health, as well as more junior folks who are sort of rising stars there at NIH. I see the presidents of behavioral medicine societies that we have in our field, and lots of other folks who are in a position to make a real impact on our field and then more broadly. We've had a few questions, a couple of questions come through. And one I'm sure that you get pretty frequently, but one of our participants has asked, hey, I'm struggling to feel hope as I watch your presentation. How do you get hope in your work? Where's the hope in your work?
Yeah, so first, thank you very much for being here. I cannot see who are the guys in the talk, so thank you for telling me that there is a lot of people, and it's very good. Thank you very much for being there. And sorry for giving depressive talk. I'm very good at that actually. That's not easy. That's not easy to have hope every morning when you wake up. At least for me, again, it's a personal question. It's a very personal question. It's a very personal question. My main hope is that it's a strange one, but let's say it. My main hope is that we will touch relatively soon some limits that will force us to change, and notably in terms of energy. So we already discussed this peak oil things that has been happening like during a lot of time, but we find new solution to develop energy, etc. And I simply think that when we will have less energy to spend in things that are maybe useless, we will have to make priority, and I hope that we will make the good priority. So here is one hope. I know it's a strange one, but I would say that it's the main one. It's the main one. And I still do think, but to be honest, I'm doing work in both mitigation and adaptation, but sometimes I'm fluctuating between the two. Like I'm really motivating to try doing some stuff around mitigation, providing tools to people. And sometimes I'm more in the mindset of, okay, I should focus on adaptation because it's going to be a nightmare and we have to be prepared. So I'm fluctuating between the two. It depends of the day and it depends of different things.
That's great. There's another question that was asked from a more junior person who's starting out, but I'll ask for both junior people and more senior people. For the junior person, what advice or recommendations do you have for someone that's just starting out in this field and wants to make a difference? And then for senior people, what's the most powerful thing we can be doing to sort of shift those of us who haven't been involved?
Paquito Bernard, the guy I mentioned in the talk, who is assistant professor in Montreal, is advocating for talking about behavior change in every classes, every trainings that we are delivering, every talks that we are delivering, and I think it's a good way to start. There is a lot of tools. EPCC are providing some very understandable things about climate change, and I think we all have to make this effort of thinking about how we can integrate, like slowly, some features of climate change in our work, and also like more importantly to communicate a lot about it. And I think that if we are training the next generation, I'm part of the next generation, but if you guys are training the next generation by communicating it and giving them some links about climate change, they will take it and use the other tools that we are developing and teaching to apply it to other topics that are maybe related to climate change. I think it's a good way to start.
Thanks, Guillaume. I also want to point people to Carl Meyer, who's also is also a participant today, is also in the audience, who's been thinking about some of these things for senior people for a while and has written some very compelling things. Carl Meyer is a good resource as well. Here's another question that I saw earlier, and the sort of broad question is, how do we think of ourselves in relation to this sort of apparent dichotomy in some of the discourse around climate change and behavior, where some people will say individual behavior doesn't matter, it's all about policy. You know, the oil companies sold everyone on the carbon footprint to gaslight us, make us feel guilty, and really we should be leaning on policymakers to make these big changes. Where should we as behavioral medicine scientists fall in the sort of individual, and then how do we influence policymakers if that's the answer?
You know, I do not have the solutions because it's such a difficult question. So again, do not have solution for that, but I believe that the market or political decisions are not happening like that. They are happening because there is changes in the social norms over time. And like if people want to eat differently, if people want to consume differently, the market will adapt to that. So I have a fun example of it, but I do not have TV. I'm not watching TV, but sometimes I'm streaming some French rugby match. And now during each advertisement during this match, it's all about greenwashing. So it's selling like SUV, sport utilitarian vehicles that are like more respective to the environment. Everything is about like having an impact on the environment, etc. And this is showing that it's becoming part of the discussion, even if it's not a discussion that I'm happy to see because it's more greenwashing to me than real climate engagement. It's becoming part of the debate. So I guess that in the future, I can see it a bit now in France. No politician will be elected if climate is not very important in their program. So things are changing in the two directions. I'm not saying that collective large actions are not needed. For sure, when you are building a lot of bicycle paths, you are more likely to see more active transportation, for sure. But policymakers are not taking this decision for nothing. They are taking this decision because in the atmosphere, in the social norms that are spreading, there is more and more individual peoples adopting something, and sharply this could translate into a collective change. So it's a very complex question, but again, it's not individual versus collective, it's individual and collective, and thinking the interaction between the two over time.
That's fascinating, and both Carl Meyer and I had sort of asked about this in the chat, your position that individual and collective behavior are actually not a dichotomy, but are closely linked. And I think I understand what you're saying, that as more individuals sort of uptake and sort of radically change behavior, then the norms change and the collective changes. So that I wonder how much, in a lot of behavioral medicine, our targets, what we try to do is change some behavior that we target by some amount. If we can get a moderate, medium effect size on physical activity or some dietary behavior, we're thrilled. It's the best thing we've ever done. But what you're asking us to do, and what you're asking people to do, are make pretty radical changes that have pretty radical shifts in mindset behind them. how do you think about the sort of effectiveness of behavioral medicine? And what are the ways that we can change in order to try to bring about truly big changes in behavior?
Again, very difficult question. So I think that maybe first point is to focus on carbon-intensive behaviors. So for example, recycling is interesting for a matter of pollution, water pollution, for example, but it's not really impactful in terms of carbon emissions. So like reducing red meat consumption is impactful. Not driving, not flying is impactful. Not flying is not unhealthy behaviors, but if you are not driving, it means that you are walking. So these two behaviors are very important if we want to make an impact. And the second thing is really to think about these multiple behavior change things and the rebound effect. There is a lot of rebound effect everywhere, and it means that when we are planning individual behavior change strategies, we have to think about the second order effect. So if I'm changing X, what will happen to Y? And at the end, what is the big picture? I think it's crucial. It's crucial because we see a lot of examples in the literature showing that we make progress in one thing, and actually it's becoming worse in another one. So it's complex, and we have to get like a very global view on one's behavior.
Thank you, Guillaume. And we haven't heard many uplifting answers from you today, but we have heard, I think, a clarion call, and that's what I'm seeing in the chat as well. And one thing I wanted to point out, Kelton Miner has posted here about a comment in the Lancet Planetary Health, maybe of interest. It's called Ecological Grief and Anxiety, the Start of a Healthy Response to Climate Change. And there's links here, and we're going to send these links out afterwards as well. There are many people who have been working in this space for a very long time, and our field has sort of drug our feet for a while. But this psychological reaction, this emotional reaction of grief and upset and sort of hopelessness is something that has been dealt with by others in the past, and they've come through it, and they figured out how to stay engaged and keep working. And that's why these papers are out there that we can read and take to heart and stay engaged. Guillaume, I have to tell you, this has been truly outstanding, and the feedback in the chat, I think, amplifies that. And I want to give you my gratitude, not only for the talk, but for the fact that you've been in it. You've stayed in this space enough to feel the grief, to feel the fear, to work through it and give us actionable information. And I hope that we'll get to work together lots in the future. This is only the first in a series of SOBC-sponsored climate and health behavior presentations, and everyone who's here on this list will also get those invitations in the future. And I hope, Guillaume, that you'll be there to comment and ask questions and challenge and that as well. So everyone, please do look out for that paper. It's already put the preprint link in the chat. Guillaume, is there anything you'd like to say before we sign off?
Yes, thank you for being there today. Sorry for not letting more time to discuss at the end. Do not hesitate to reach out to me if you want to continue this discussion, if you think about some things, if you have feedback on our preprint, anything. I'm happy to chat. And again, I don't think that the transition from your research right now to a research which is more close to climate change outcomes, it's that difficult to do. Like, we have a lot of tools in our hands to start working on it. So yeah, let's do it, and thank you.
Thank you. And the video for this presentation will be posted on the Science of Behavior Change website, www.scienceofbehaviorchange.org. It'll also be on YouTube. There's opportunities for continuing education credits, all the good stuff. So thank you for being here. Everyone, have a fantastic rest of the week, and look forward to working side by side with you. Okay.
Ciao, thank you.